that I have a breakdown of the definitions that are provided to you in the textbook. And so let's go down the list to kind of see how emotions play out. First, at the physiological bare bones level. So we experience emotions through our bodily changes. This involves, but is not limited to, increased heartbeat, rise in blood pressure, feeling that warm, tingly feeling. Often when you are angry, for example, you will see higher rises in blood pressure and heartbeat because of that anger. And those physiological changes, as you can see right here in the teal color, give rise to what we see here in the orange, which are nonverbal reactions. So someone might not see, your rise in blood pressure, but they definitely see the effects of it, because the effects of it are blushing, sweating, and different behavioral changes. Our emotions and our posture often change with one another. If you remember back to chapter 6 when I talked about those athletes, those track athletes that were born congenitally blind, but when they were told they won a race, they would put their hands up like this and go, yes. And so we find that emotional nonverbal expression is pretty universal amongst all human beings, regardless of culture or background. We also find, for example, when you are afraid, when human beings are experiencing fear, we tend to close ourselves off, so our posture becomes a little bit more closed in. We hold ourselves. If you're ever watching a scary movie and you are watching a super scary part of the movie and you go, and you kind of hold your head or you hold yourself, that's a natural nonverbal reaction to the emotion of fear. And so we do have these very universal understandings of how emotions play out nonverbally, but we also have to take in the cognitive or the mental factor. And so I think oftentimes people separate the emotions from the mental, so we see them as two different sides of ourselves. But really, we have to remember as communicators that your cognitive dimension will always affect your emotional expression. And so we engage in what you see in green right here, cognitive interpretations. This is when the way we perceive something or take something in mentally can always affect how we feel about something, right? The mind plays a huge role in how we feel. So, for example, very much relatable to chapter 3 when we learned about the self-fulfilling prophecy. If you have the cognitive mindset that when you walk into a classroom or you walk into a test and you're like, I'm going to fail, I'm not going to do good, that will not only possibly be part of your self-fulfilling prophecy, but it also dictates how you feel about the class and how you feel about the test. So if you absolutely hate math, like me, I had a very negative emotional reaction to my math exams, to my math assignments, and to my math classes in general. At times, I would even feel literal dread coming to class, like I just didn't want to be there. And so you can see that how I thought cognitively, the way I think about math, changed the way I feel about math, and then that also, the way I felt about math, continued to feed into how I thought about math, and it's a very cyclical nature. One specific example of a cognitive interpretation would be here you see in pink the word reappraisal, and this is when we try to rethink the meaning of events in order to change how we feel about it. Oftentimes this is a defense mechanism that we engage in to protect our sense of self. So again, going back to chapter 3, when we learned about the self always wants to protect itself, to shield itself from hurtful things, and all of us in our lives will experience traumatic events that will make us feel very vulnerable, and at times we may engage in reappraisal to try to rethink the way we're looking at those events in order to make ourselves feel a little bit better about the situation as a whole. So one example of reappraisal would be a breakup. And I see this cyclical nature happening quite often, not only with my group of friends, but also in the journals that you guys share with me. So one example would be once you break up with someone, let's say that person broke up with you, and you might come over to my house. I'm your friend. I'm comforting you. I'm giving you wine and mimosas and letting you pet my dog, and we're getting all that TLC out. And so after the person breaks up with you, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, you're like, I didn't even need that person. I'm so glad I broke up with them. They were so terrible to me. And you start engaging in reappraisal, where your mind starts to pick out things that you disliked about that person or disliked about your relationship to justify the hurt that you might be feeling. Like, oh, they broke up with me? Well, I'm glad that they did, right? And ultimately what happens is that ends up delaying us actually working through our feelings most of the time. So you might feel 3 or 4 weeks after a breakup like, I don't even need that person. I don't even know why I was so hung up about them. Maybe 5-6 months later, it hits you again and you start truly feeling like, wow, I really do miss that person, or I do miss the relationship. And then you have to take that time to work through the emotion again. And so reappraisal is just any time we try to use our mind to make us feel better about a situation. So if I'm hurt emotionally from a breakup, I'll rethink and reframe the relationship and the breakup in my head so that I don't feel, keyword feel, as bad about this traumatic event of a breakup. And ultimately, we do find in studies that breakups should be treated almost as if a loved one has died. And so I've read some papers where psychologists assert that when you break up with someone, the trauma you feel emotionally is very similar to the trauma you feel when you lose someone in your life that you love. And I mean, it quite is similar, right? The death of a relationship is quite similar to the death of someone or something that you love very dearly. So it's not uncommon for that to happen either during breakups, but reappraisal can also occur for small things. That doesn't have to be super traumatic. So let's say you're at a job interview and you say something very silly and you kind of regret saying it. And as you're driving home later, you're feeling very anxious about it. You're feeling very nervous. Your mind might say, well, I gave better answers to the other questions, so maybe they didn't notice, my one stupid answer. They probably paid more attention to my smart answer. So that's your brain trying to reappraise or reevaluate the situation in order to reframe it so that you emotionally feel better. Okay. Ultimately, we also use verbal expressions to display our emotions. And so verbal expressions help us express how we're feeling, and not all of us are very good at expressing our emotions verbally, me included, and I'm sure a lot of you may feel the same way. You might be experiencing a lot of emotions, but not quite capable of expressing them emotionally. That's okay. You can also express them non-verbally. But those who do like to use verbal expressions, we use different words that the book refers to as emotion words. And so when we're trying to express ourselves, we go to these go-to emotion words to try to share how we're feeling. A friend of mine, for example, in the past has had a partner who was not loyal to her, who cheated on her. And now that she has broken up with him and is currently with a new partner, romantic partner, she's very anxious often about getting cheated on again. And it's constantly in the back of her head. And so sometimes she will use very emotionally charged words like, I feel betrayed. And even the word betrayed is an example of an emotion word, right? It's a very emotionally packed word, no matter what context it comes in. And so you'll notice that as we're trying to express our emotions, we will have these go-to words that we seek out and that we use when we're trying to share how we feel. So there is our breakdown of emotions in a nutshell. And so now that we kind of understand both the physiological, the body aspect of emotion, and how emotions are expressed both non-verbally and verbally, and how the mind is involved with emotions, let's kind of look into how emotions are influenced. So how is it that we have learned to behave in certain ways, to express our emotion in certain ways, or not? And the biggest key that we find as communication researchers as a major influence on our emotions is our personality. And your personality, for example, whether you're an extrovert or an introvert, or if you're stubborn or if you're not, if you are super bubbly and positive, or you happen to be more independent or reserved. Our personality dictates a lot of how we experience, and keyword here being express our emotions. Because remember, as communicators, we are interested in the expression of emotions because they influence any given communication interaction. And so some examples I want to give you here that the textbook also shares with you is how you have to remember that personality is a huge factor in how we experience and express our emotions, but it doesn't have to be the end-all be-all. So for example, shy people may not have a lot of communication satisfaction when it comes to expressing emotions one-on-one, but they might find a lot of success and be very satisfied with expressing their emotions comfortably online. And so that's just one example of many in the ways that our personality can influence our choices in how we express our emotions. If you are definitely a more A-type, bubbly, outgoing personality, you might feel more comfortable expressing yourself emotionally versus someone who might be more introverted and might be a little bit more protective of how they express themselves. But regardless of your personality, we all have emotions and we all experience them in very similar ways. The only difference is the expression. As always, in every chapter, this keeps coming back. Culture and gender will always be there to influence how we express our emotions and also how we judge the expression of other people's emotions. And again, that's very key for us as communicators because we're interested not just in where the emotions come from, but how they manifest both non-verbally, in our posture and our facial expressions, as well as how they manifest in verbal communication. So the first factor you see here in orange is culture. Culture will always play a role in the way that we interpret other people's emotions. Keyword there is interpret. That's a throwback to chapter 1 in the communication model where both sender and receiver have to decode and encode messages at the same time. And so the keyword interpret means really that we're not always 100% accurate with how we take in other people's emotional expressions. And ultimately, that's also because we express our own emotions in a multitude of different ways that have been dictated okay or not okay, appropriate or not appropriate by the culture that we've grown up in. So, for example, one of my students in his journals for chapter 8 talked a lot about machismo. And so for those of you who don't know or have not heard of machismo before, it's this kind of idea of a hyper masculine, strong man that kind of runs the family household. And not only is he masculine in the household and dominant sense, but he's also masculine looking, right? He's he doesn't wear, tighter clothes. He's the epitome of what we would perceive to be a masculine man, kind of muscles and all of that. So my student who is of Latino descent talks in his journal about struggling with machismo because his father wants him to be machismo, like very masculine looking, very muscly, but he himself is a little bit of a leaner body type and he likes to wear skinny jeans and tighter clothes that don't typically fit in with machismo. On top of that, because of machismo, he was socialized as a child to not express his emotions very outwardly, very openly. And so if he ever felt sad and cried, his father actually punished him for it because it's not machismo, it's not masculine, right, for a boy to cry. And so you can see with just that example that culture dictates a lot of the ways we express ourselves. You'll also find here in the United States, because we're much more individualist and much more low context in our cultural values, that we tend to be very emotionally expressive. This is why we love our reality TV shows. We love the drama. We love watching drama. And you'll find that other countries that are more collectivist, more high context, tend to not be as emotionally expressive. Another example of that was I was once at a bridal party. So my girlfriend was getting married and her mother decided to throw a big party with all her girlfriends and her to commemorate her getting married. And I chide her a little bit for this communication decision, but it was at her party that she decided that she would announce that she is pregnant. And her family is more traditional and does not, they just didn't like that she was pregnant before she was married. So I had a weird kind of out-of-body emotional experience. My first trigger as an individualist growing up in America, I wanted to hug her, I wanted to throw my hands in the air, I wanted to scream, I wanted to be so excited and happy for her because she's going to be a mom, she's going to have a baby. As her girlfriend, I'm very thrilled. But because we were in the cultural context of her family, I had to kind of put on my collectivist, high context hat and kind of look around and see, well, how are her parents reacting? And when I saw her parents, her mom kind of non-verbally crossed her arms and had a little bit of a frown like this. That kind of signaled to me that in that situation, I could not express my yay, so happy for you emotion. All I did was congratulate her, and I tried to reserve my emotions a little bit more. That's just another example of how culture plays into the way that we express our emotions. In that cultural context, I didn't feel it was appropriate for me to be super vivacious and joyful for her, particularly because the rest of the room was not as much. I definitely was myself later when it was just her and I, but you can see there that culture played a big role in how I chose in that moment to communicate my congratulations for her. You also see gender conflate with culture a lot. So for example, machismo, as I just mentioned, tends to play into Latino families, specifically only for men, right? For the male gender, the masculine gender. And it's not so much of an issue for females. And so it's always important to take both culture and gender into context. But generally speaking, in America, there is some, and I put this in red for a reason, there is some truth to the cultural stereotype of the inexpressive male, so the very stoic male, and the demonstrative or very expressive, emotionally loud female. And that is because of socialization. We have found, and we've discussed this in past chapters as well, that women, young girls are socialized that it's okay to cry and be very emotionally expressive, whereas boys tend to be a little bit more policed about that when they're young. And so it's all about socialization. Remember in chapter 2, culture is taught. So the culture of masculinity, the culture of femininity are all taught values. And so we've learned, right, to either express our emotions a lot or not express our emotions a lot based off the gender presentation that our parents and society has found acceptable for us. That's not to say, though, that men and women don't experience the same emotions. They definitely do. We're both human beings, and so we both experience them in the same way, but we might express them in varying ways. So it's not uncommon for a man to think that women are overly dramatic, and it's not uncommon for women to think men are indifferent or don't care. And that's because since we've learned to express our emotions in different ways, either more demonstratively or not, or inexpressively, that's why there is kind of that gap between males and females when it comes to expressing their emotions. Other influences are social conventions and roles. And so all of you are aspiring to find a career, and I hope that it is a career that brings you joy, gives you purpose in life, and something that you are really good at and that you love doing. And no matter what career you're part of, you may or may not have to engage in emotional labor at different times. Big roles that I know right now off the top of my head require a lot of emotional labor are police officers, anyone in the medical field, especially nurses and doctors who have to be one-on-one with patients, and pharmacists as well. Education and in the law or anything regarding like legal society. And so if you're in any of those careers, you'll probably practice a lot of emotional labor. And all emotional labor means is that you choose to manage and suppress your emotions in a given moment where you find it appropriate. And so one example would be my friend who is an EMT. He sees a lot of crazy things when he picks people up in his ambulance, and he can't allow his emotions to get in the way of his work in that moment. He has to save a life. And so no matter how saddened he feels or frustrated or angry or fearful, he can't allow those emotions to dictate his work in that moment. So he has to practice a lot of emotional labor in order to make sure that he stays focused on the job. Police officers are very similar as well. Police officers, I'm sure, just like all human beings, will feel fear, will feel anger, will feel sadness. And when they're on the job, they often cannot allow those emotions to be expressed or to overtake them, as we might allow ourselves to. And that's because that's part of the job, right? Scooting down. Social media is another influence, and so we find that, I'm sure you all know this, and so I'm preaching to the choir, probably, is that people tend to be much more emotionally expressive online than they are in person. It can go from 0 to 100 real quick, and I'm sure you have all seen it. My favorite example is when I go to YouTube channels and I'll be watching Drake or Rihanna or Beyonce or whatever, and I'll scroll down to the comments and someone will write, I hate Rihanna or Drake sucks. And part of me is like, then why are you on their YouTube page? Ugh. But it's weird that we have this this no filter form of communication when it comes to online social media emotional expression. We tend to go very extreme with our emotions. We do the all caps, right? We do extra exclamation points or question marks. We tend to amp ourselves up on social media by making something seem sadder or happier than it really is. And so we find that senders and receivers experience emotions much more intensely online for whatever reason, that those online expressions tend to be felt at a more visceral level than you would face to face, which is very interesting when you think about it. And lastly, emotional contagion. You've all been a victim of the emotional contagion, for better or for worse. And you've all been a perpetrator of the emotional contagion, for better or for worse. And so the emotional contagion refers to this process by which emotions are literally transferred from one person to another. Think of it as catching a cold, right? But instead of catching a cold, you're catching that person's emotions. And this has all happened to us, maybe you're not having such a good day, but you go home and one of your family members is super happy and joyful to see you and is upbeat, and that just kind of picks up your mood really quickly, and you kind of catch their happiness or their joy. On the reverse side, you can also catch negative emotions. So let's say you're having a great day or a normal day, and you go home to a family member who's very grumpy, who's not in a good mood. You may yourself also become grumpy or irritable or not in a good mood because you can catch their emotions. It's very fascinating. And so it's also reminds us as communicators to be careful of who we surround ourselves with, because we always, of course, want to surround ourselves with people who, for the most part, provide us emotional joy and a positive emotional place to be in. And it doesn't happen super slowly. You could just see someone at work and immediately catch their emotions, right? It can occur very quickly with even little to no verbal communication. A majority of emotional contagion occurs through nonverbal communication. So, when you see your boss at work and they're already sitting like this with their arms crossed and they're just non-verbally showing you that they're not in a good mood, you don't really need any verbal confirmation from them that they're in a bad mood, right? And you might very quickly catch that bad mood of theirs without even knowing that you're catching it. So very careful about that. So now we move on to emotional intelligence. How do we master a lot of the things that we've been talking about throughout this class? And the biggest thread of this class has been competency, right? Competency. How can we achieve communication that is both effective and appropriate in any given context? And in here in chapter 8, what we're really worried about is how can we develop a sense of emotional awareness and management where we can set ourselves up to be more competent communicators when it comes to the realm of emotion. And one of the ways we do that is by developing our EQ, or emotional intelligence. So like all human beings, we have an EQ and an IQ. I'm sure you guys have heard the phrase IQ, or intelligence quota, before. And IQ simply refers to your brain's ability, your intelligence, right? Whether or not you are able to adapt to any given situation, how smart you are. That's all IQ. But EQ is another dimension that I think we don't quite provide enough attention to in our everyday lives. And EQ refers to the idea to do two things: your ability to manage and understand your own emotions, and also be sensitive to other people's feelings. And so online, I actually have you take an emotional IQ test where I ask you to think about the varying ways in which you are able to not only recognize your own emotions, but also manage them and cope with them, having a coping mechanism for them. And that's key. You may be able to be very aware of the emotions that you are feeling, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can manage them, right? So case in point, let's say you're very angry at your boss, and the first kind of knee-jerk reaction you do is send your boss a really nasty email. So you might be very aware, right, and understanding I'm angry, but you're not managing the emotion very well if you are blasting off really angry emails. Does that make sense? And so the management part of it is, can you actually engage in behaviors to cope with your emotions in a productive and positive way where it doesn't in an ideal world, provide destruction to the relationships around you. The second half of emotional intelligence is to be sensitive to others. And I want to couch this in context. So I know that you've all been told to be sensitive or that you were insensitive. The phrase here, to be sensitive to others' feelings, specifically means that you are able to understand and manage other people's emotions, okay? So just as how I talked about how you need to understand and manage your own emotions, you have to be able to also do that for other people. And that's what it truly means to be sensitive to other people. I know the word sensitive can be a little tricky. Don't think of it in our normal everyday use of it. Here doesn't mean that you baby other people or are politically correct or overly sensitive to them. The word sensitive in this context of communication study means that you can understand, you can identify, oh, that person is sad, or that person is angry, or that person is whatever, and learn how to manage their emotions. So one example of this is, let's say you have a friend of yours, maybe, your friend is very angry at their boss and wants to send a nasty email. So if you have a high emotional intelligence when it comes to others, and you're sensitive to others, as you can see here, you will not only be able to recognize that your friend is very emotional and angry, so that's one part of it, understanding it, but you'll also be able to manage your friend's anger and emotions in that moment. You might be able to talk them down and say, hey, you know what, you should wait on that email. Or hey, you know what, maybe you should talk to your boss face to face instead of sending an email. That's an example of how you're able to manage other people's emotions and understand other people's emotions. So that's what the phrase be sensitive to other people's feelings means here in context. So please remember that. I know we use the word being sensitive in our everyday language, and so just try to remember it in the context of communication studies. And so if you have the time, please make sure to watch this video. Very helpful summary of what EQ is. And it's always good to watch that right before you take your emotional intelligence survey as well online. I think I knew I skipped a slide. Okay. So, how do we practice emotional intelligence? How does that actually manifest itself? So one of the key ways that it manifests itself is being able to express your emotions constructively. As you can see here in the green, expressing your emotions is great, but it's very important to do it constructively, because you could express your emotions destructively, right? You could just explode in anger or fear or any other type of negative emotion and quite easily unravel from that. And so as communicators, we are seeking to make sure our emotions are expressed, not held in, expressed, but expressed constructively. Sharing emotions often improves relationships. So for any of you who have are in a romantic relationship, have children, or are really close to someone who you share a lot of emotions with, a bulk of the trust that you get out of relationships comes from sharing emotions with other people. It's very important. And of course, how do you share emotions? You self-disclose, as we talked about in Chapter 3, and the other person has to listen, as we talked about in Chapter 7. It's all connected. So, how do we make sure we express our emotions constructively instead of destructively? First thing is recognizing our feelings. I think quite often we suppress our emotions when it's not appropriate. The only time it's really appropriate to suppress your emotions is if you're engaging in emotional labor, as we talked about just previous to this. When it's required by your job or required for the situation, yes, practice emotional labor. But when that's not a factor, you should definitely express your feelings and recognize them. So you need to admit to yourself, I'm angry right now, or I'm sad right now, or I'm very, very excited right now, and be very aware of what you're doing and what you're feeling as a result of it. And so that's why here, this is really the first chunk, the first part of emotional intelligence, as we just talked about in the last slide, being able to be aware of and understanding your emotions. And so you have to know what you're feeling, what it is. You need to be able to monitor physiologically what's happening to your body and the nonverbal behaviors that are occurring as a result. So if I know that I feel angry, and I feel that anger on my face. And a lot of us have, right? We try to hide our emotions, but you can feel it on your face when your body can't hide the fact that you are stressed out or angry or upset or any type of emotion. And so it's important that you recognize what type of nonverbal behaviors you're also engaging in that may or may not be giving that away, and recognizing the thoughts and verbal messages sent to others as well. So oftentimes when I'm feeling very, very nervous about something, so I might have a very important meeting coming out, I might be going to a conference where I have to present and I'm very nervous. Sometimes those emotions will come up on my face and I will just be like this the whole day, and I'll just look worried, and people will be concerned and be like, are you okay? And I have to remember that I'm feeling anxious right now. So that's the step one right here. You see in the flow, I'm feeling anxious right now. The second one is I recognize that my face is changing and my body is changing, and it's definitely sending messages to other people that I am worried and that I'm stressed out. And if that's a message I don't want to send, then I need to learn how to start dealing with my nervousness in a more productive way, which I do. And so how do you do that? You can choose one of these four options. Or all of them, depending on the situation. But to constructively express your emotions, once you become aware of them, once you understand the nonverbal and verbal signals that you're sending off to other people and how that's affecting people, you need to remember, first and foremost, to choose the best language. I love this definition that is provided to you in your textbook. It states, many suffer from impoverished emotional vocabularies. What that means is that because we're not too used to and we don't have a lot of practice with our EQ and with expressing ourselves and our emotions, we tend to not have the vocabulary or the language skill set required to effectively and constructively express our emotions. For any of you who have ever felt angry or frustrated or sad or disappointed, but you can't quite verbalize how you're feeling, like you struggle sharing it with other people, this may be a skill that I encourage you to explore and talk about in your summative papers. The second one is sharing multiple feelings. We do not have the emotional range of a teaspoon. We're very complex creatures, and we have an innate ability to feel multiple things at one time. So going back to my example of a breakup, you might be feeling anger, you might be feeling hurt, you might be feeling surprised, you might be feeling disappointed, upset, vulnerable, and you might be feeling all of those emotions all at once. And what we typically do as communicators is we just pick one of those emotions and focus on just one of them to communicate about, when really we should be expressing all of the things that we're feeling in any given situation. And so that's very important that when you are communicating about your emotions, that you take the time to share all of the feelings that you're feeling. Very rarely do people actually feel just one feeling at a time. Most of the time, you're at least feeling 2 or 3 different emotions when it comes to events in your life. The third one here in blue is recognize the difference between feeling and acting. And what that refers to is at times we psych ourselves out, going back to this idea of the cognitive, of the mind affecting our emotions, is that we fear that, if I get in touch with this feeling and I tell that other person that I am mad at them, or that I'm disappointed, or that I'm feeling vulnerable, if I share that with them, then, they won't want to be my friend anymore, or they'll break up with me. And we kind of psych ourselves out and make ourselves think that if I breathe this emotion into truth, right? If I speak it into truth and power, then bad things will happen. So remember that there's a difference between feeling and acting. You could feel angry at someone, but that doesn't mean that expressing that feeling of anger and being in touch with that feeling of anger will result in any negative behaviors on yours or their part, right? And so don't fear that disastrous, terrible things will happen once you start expressing your emotions. We're often very afraid of expressing our emotions simply because we think, well, how is this person going to react, right? And we're always worried about that, and I think we don't worry about it so much. Lastly, accept responsibility for your feelings. if the phrase right here saying using I language sounds familiar to you, that is a throwback to chapter 4, where we talked about taking responsibility for our perceptions, and also to chapter 5 as well. And so one of the things that we have to remember is that we have to be responsible for the way that we feel, and we need to say that in our language. So our often default way of talking is, well, Sam, you did this and you made me upset, and you didn't do this and you didn't do that, and you are the reason I'm mad, right? And we do a you a lot in the way that we approach expressing our emotions. And really, what should we do? We should be doing is the I. We should be practicing, Sam, I felt really betrayed when you did X, right? I perceive that as, or I feel that means we're not very good friends. So you take responsibility for the way you feel by using I and making I the leading pronoun of all your sentences when it comes to expressing your emotions. And lastly, choose the best time and place to express your emotions. I think that it's pretty self-explanatory. And I think that this final purple idea right here, I think, applies to all of these different guidelines as well. I'm sure that we've all picked a very wrong time to express our emotions and regretted it. So it's important that you choose a time that is good for you, good for the other person, that you don't, bring up a fight with your romantic partner when you guys are out at a birthday party, right? It's usually not the best time to do it. If anything, we find that couples who fight in public a lot tend to have fights that escalate far quicker than they need to. So just keep that in mind. So time and place are important. And we learned this in chapter 1 when we learned about the communication model, right? So there are two types of emotions that we want to, one we want to avoid and one we want to achieve. If we have managed our emotions correctly, we are in the facilitative category over here on the left. And when you manage your emotions in a facilitative way, that means that you are expressing your emotions, you are aware of them, you are communicating actively about them, you are using all the guidelines that we just talked about, and you are allowing yourself to be angry, be frustrated, be irritated, but in small little bouts where it's controlled and productive. And so that's a facilitative way of managing your emotions, right? So it's not that you should suppress all your anger or irritation or negative emotions in this category. It just means that you allow the other person to know that you're angry or that you're irritated, but you're doing it in a controlled way. On the other end, we have debilitative, and this is uncontrolled. So we usually, in this category, get emotions that are super intense, that last a very long time, usually get fights that last 2, 3, 4 hours with people just kind of raising their voice at each other, saying very hurtful things that they don't mean. And this is an example of a debilitative emotional management because we are expressing our emotions in this category, but we're not doing it constructively. We're not doing it in a way to promote working through the emotion. We're doing it in a way to vent about the emotion, and that's not what we want as communicators. I put the Taylor Swift Bad Blood thing here, not because I'm a Taylor Swift fan, but because it's a good reminder that one example of a debilitative emotion is the desire for revenge, right? So oftentimes when someone has wronged us, we may or may not want to seek revenge on them or hope that karma, does something bad to them as a result or whatever. And so that's an example of a debilitative emotion because when you want revenge on someone or you want them to hurt as much as they've hurt you, what you're really saying is, I want to hold on to this feeling and I don't want to work through it and I just want to feel it at an intense and long level. True facilitative emotional management means you are working through the emotion day by day. You're not ready to totally let it go overnight, but you are working to work through the emotion rather than let it overtake you and make you have a desire for revenge or desire for anything else. Okay? So, to close out this lecture, we have to remember as communicators, as I said earlier, the cognitive dimension will always affect our feelings and our emotions. And so there is a theory called the rational emotive approach. Here you see it in purple, where they determine that you can change your feelings by changing unproductive interpretations. So let me go back real quick. Let's say that you are in the debilitative state. You want to get to the facilitative. One of the ways you could do that is by reframing or rethinking the way you are perceiving the conflict, the fight, the event. Okay? According to the rational emotive approach, it is not the event or the issue itself that causes your emotion. It's the belief about the event or the person that causes your feeling. What that means is, let's say that a bully is bullying me. I'm a young child, a bully is bullying me, and I'm very, very emotionally hurt by it. According to the rational emotive approach, it's not the bully that's causing my emotions. It's how I'm allowing the bully to, how I'm interpreting the bully's behaviors and actions. And so what we need to recognize, according to the rational emotive approach, is that our interpretation, or the way we perceive an event or a person, determines our feelings. So what the rational emotive approach advocates for is three things. They want you to note the activating event. So this is just a fancy phrase for what is it that's bothering you. You need to pay attention to what the event makes you think or believe. And then you need to recognize how your thoughts or belief lead to the emotional consequences. So one example I have for you here is, let's go back to my bullying example. Being called names is the event. If you are called a name like stupid or you're dumb or I can't believe you did that, you might think to yourself, oh, I must not be a good student, or I must not be a good friend or a good worker. I've done something wrong. That thought will then lead you to get upset or hurt. According to the rational emotive approach, it is this right here, your thought or belief, that leads you to feel upset or hurt, not the event itself. Okay, so it's kind of key. And I've had students agree or disagree with this approach. I think it works in certain contexts and not others, personally. But I think it's a great and powerful way to empower yourself to rethink the way you feel about an event or a person, so that you don't end up with the consequences of being loaded with emotions that maybe you don't want to be loaded with. So in sum, the rational emotive approach just reminds us that at any given time, the best way to deal with an emotion or prevent a negative emotion from overtaking you is by knowing what is triggering you, what is the activating event, and making sure you interrupt your feelings, stop them from happening by reframing the way you think about them. So if I did this correctly and redid it again, if my activating event is being called names, instead of thinking I've done something wrong or I'm a bad person or I suck, I think maybe this person just is calling me names because they're frustrated or they're hurt and it has nothing to do with me. If you think that, then perhaps you won't feel the emotional consequences of being upset or hurt. Okay? So that's what the rational emotive approach teaches us or tells us about our emotions as it relates to our thoughts. So, we've talked a lot about facilitative emotions, how we want to get there. I shared with you guidelines. I shared with you the rational emotive approach, which is just another tool you can use to make sure that you stay on the facilitative track. But often than not, I'm sure all of you have engaged in debilitative emotions where you don't work through them. They end up affecting your quality of life and are with you all the time. Why does that happen? Because we commit fallacies or errors in logic. And those errors in logic then lead us to feel emotions that perhaps we didn't need to feel to begin with. This is very much in line with the rational emotive approach. So the rational emotive approach, as I just covered, says that the way we think about an event dictates the consequences or the emotions that we get out of it. And so here, all this slide is saying is that because we commit logical fallacies, meaning that we engage in irrational thinking that doesn't make any sense, that thinking then leads us to engage in debilitative emotions. So let me give you an example so you can kind of understand this a little bit more in context. So one fallacy or error or irrational thinking that we engage in, illogical thinking, is called the fallacy of perfection. And this is the thought that you should always be perfect and be completely confident and skillful. So the moment, for example, we say a dumb joke that doesn't go the right way, the moment at a job interview we say something silly or don't say the answer to a question the way we want it to be said, what will happen is we will engage in the fallacy of perfection where we're like, oh, I should have said that better. I should have done that better. I know better than this. I should have given a better answer. That type of thinking may lead you to feel more embarrassed, more ashamed, and lead you to feel like you're not valuable as a person because of your desire to be perfect all the time. And that's a fallacy because none of us can be perfect, competent communicators all the time. I definitely make mistakes in my everyday life as well, both personal and professional. And so we have to remember that we can't engage in the fallacy of perfection. More examples. Another example is the fallacy of approval. This is the belief that we need to get everybody's approval. And when we say everybody, it can mean literally everybody, but can also mean people that we care about, our significant others. Going back to chapter 3 when we talked about significant others, people that are important to us, whose opinions we particularly care about. And so if you engage in the fallacy of approval, you're constantly seeking the approval of others. That's not always possible. I'm sure you have all learned that by now, that you can't please everybody, and you can't get everybody's approval on everything. And so we engage in that fallacy hoping to get people's approval, and then when it doesn't happen, the consequence is we feel sad, we feel we're not worthy, we feel disappointed. So the rational emotive approach tells us, don't engage in this type of thinking, and then you won't feel, low or incapable. Okay, again, this thread is very similar and related. The next one is the fallacy of should. We all engage in this, the woulda, coulda, shoulda, wish it happened, I want this to happen, what if this had happened. We play this game with ourselves all the time where we wish something was one way and it's obviously not that way, but because we wish so much that it was that way, we end up making ourselves feel very disappointed, very frustrated, very angry. So for example, let's say that you took an exam for a class and it didn't go as well as you thought it did. Maybe you thought you got a B and you ended up getting a D. And so what you might do is you might think, oh, I should have done better on that. I can't believe I didn't do better on that. Why didn't I do better on that? And you kind of get stuck in the past a lot where you end up mulling over how terribly you did, how you should have done better, what could have happened if you had done better. Maybe I would get an A by now in this class if I just passed that test. And what happens is that because we end up playing the woulda, shoulda, coulda, this could have happened, this should have happened game, we end up damaging ourselves because we allow ourselves to feel emotionally distraught or frustrated, right? Feeling like this should have happened and it didn't, all that kind of thinking does is make you more frustrated, right? And I'm sure we can all agree on that. Again, real quick, this is all of this is related. All of these fallacies are related to the rational emotive approach, which tells us that if we change the way we think about something, then it'll change our emotions about it. So here, these fallacies are here to remind us that we have to avoid this type of thinking so that we don't allow ourselves to feel debilitative emotions. So if you keep thinking, right, as I said here, that, oh, this should have happened, I wish this could have happened, why didn't this happen? All you're doing is reframing the situation in your mind in a negative way where you are left longing for something more. And of course, as a result, you will emotionally feel disappointed or frustrated. Okay. Next step, I got more fallacies for you. So the first one here is the fallacy of overgeneralization. This is when you base a belief on a limited amount of evidence. We do this often, more so than we think. We tend to believe very easily a lot of the stuff that we hear on social media, stuff that we hear from other people. And one of the things we have to remember is to go back to chapter 7 and make sure that we are critically listening when we are engaging in the fallacy of overgeneralization, because critical listening is kind of the cure for this fallacy. Oftentimes we will get very small pieces of evidence and generalize to that, and that'll make us feel different things about an event. So let's say you've taken a communication studies class before and you really didn't like it, you didn't do that well, next semester you take another communication studies class and you're like, oh, this class will probably be just like my class last semester. That's an overgeneralization because not all classes are the same. And when you've only taken one class, you can't really use that one class or that one piece of evidence to generalize to all communication studies classes, right? And so that's an example of how the fallacy of overgeneralization will make us feel positive or negative, overly positive, overly negative about different events or people. The fallacy of causation is the next one. This is the belief that you shouldn't do anything because it'll cause harm or inconvenience to others, and it'll cause undesirable feelings. As kids, I feel like we did this a lot where we were like, oh, I don't want to tell my crush that I like them because we won't be friends anymore, right? They won't like me anymore or things like that. And so we tend to project into the future a lot of, I think this will happen. And it kind of leads us in a debilitative emotional state instead of facilitative, because now we're not working through the emotion. We're now just mulling the emotion over and not expressing it. So very important that we don't fall into this fallacy. The fallacy of helplessness is that stuff just happened and there's nothing I could do about it. Of course, I understand stuff happens, life happens, things get in the way and prevent you from achieving your dreams or achieving your goals or achieving an A in a class or whatever the case may be. But one of the things we don't want to fall into is the fallacy of helplessness where, well, what can I do about it? It's always going to suck, right? We can't allow ourselves to feel helpless all the time because then what type of agency do we have? Which is none, right? We're taking away our own agency or ability to act on our own. And so we cannot allow ourselves to just sit back and say, well, it's helpless. Like, what can I do? You know, it's always going to be this way. Most things in this world are not always going to stay the same. Things change. And so remember to never fall into the fallacy of helplessness because you are all really capable of great things. And so don't let this fallacy make you feel, keyword feel, incapable. Okay? The fallacy of catastrophic expectations. I am absolutely a victim of this. I do this all the time and I have to check myself. And you may do it as well, where you assume if something bad can happen, it will. And so for me, I like to over-prepare for everything. I over-prepare. I make extra copies for things. I always stay extra for things. Like I always feel like if the worst thing could happen, it will happen. And so we have to remember that if we always expect bad things to happen, of course that's going to affect how we feel about an event or how we feel about the world in general. So be very careful about that. I have to check myself as well. So I'm right there with you. So quick summary. We've learned about the definition of emotions. We've learned about what they are at both a physiological level as well as how our mind comes into play. We developed how the mind comes into play when we learned about the rational emotive approach and the different fallacies, logical fallacies that we engage in our brain that then make us feel either better or worse about things. And so those fallacies, remember, illogical, they're irrational forms of thought that drive our emotions to extremes, and they do not allow us to manage our emotions in a facilitative way. We also talked about the different influences on emotion. We talked about personality, we talked about culture, and we talked about gender. We also talked about social role, especially when we talked about emotional labor. We talked about how different people in different social roles have to engage in emotional labor in order to achieve their goals or their job. Another example of that is parents. Parents have to engage in emotional labor all the time. And now here we are at the very final end of this lecture, ready to learn about, well, what do we do to avoid those debilitative emotions? What do we do when we are engaging in irrational thinking that is leading us to feel terrible emotions that are debilitating to us? So the first thing is that we have to monitor our emotional interaction, our emotional reactions, meaning that we have to have high EQ, as I talked about. You have to be self-aware of what you're feeling and be able to manage it and cope with it. Have productive coping behaviors and mechanisms that'll help you work through the emotion. The second one is to note the activating event, as we just talked about in the rational emotive approach. Like, know what it is that is triggering you, know what it is that you are sensitive to. That could be specific people, types of individuals, different settings, topics of conversation. It could be a variety of things that kind of set you off. So just know which one it is. Record your self-talk. This could be literally recording, like with a microphone, or you could also record your self-talk by just being aware of, how am I talking to myself? How am I framing myself? And I think that's really important, because our self-talk dictates a lot about how we feel about ourselves and other people. And so when we are more self-aware of the ways we are talking to ourselves, the better we are able to actually effectively manage our emotions and cope with them. The fourth one is dispute your irrational beliefs, right? Find something else that is a little bit more sensible. So for me, I like to engage in the fallacy of catastrophic expectations all the time. If the worst thing can happen, I always assume that it will. And so what I do is I go out and seek advice from friends, family members, loved ones, and I say, hey, I'm about to go deliver this lecture at a conference or present at this conference. I feel like I'm just going to get up there and forget everything I'm going to say, forget my whole speech, right? So I'm already thinking that, if the worst thing can happen, it will. And the worst thing that could happen is me forgetting my presentation. And so I have my friends that'll tell me, Ava, you've done conferences before, you've done presentations before, you've never forgotten your speech entirely. It's not possible, and you're just engaging in irrational thinking right now that's making you feel very anxious about this conference more than you need to. And so what I do is I choose to believe, like, oh yeah, you have a point. That's an alternate belief that's a little bit more sensible, right? Of course, it makes more sense that I will most likely at least do okay on the presentation based off of my history. I'm not going to forget my entire speech, right? And so it helps when we do engage in irrational beliefs to go seek advice from other people, or for ourselves, find ways for them to be disputed by trying to think a little bit more rationally. All right, so lastly, now that we know how to avoid debilitative emotions, how do we maximize or make the best out of our facilitative emotions? So one of the first things we need to do is leave the room, right? Savor positive emotions. The second one is to regard challenging situations opportunities for growth. I know that sounds very cookie cutter, but one of the most awesome things I think about communication in general is that you're able to communicate about your emotions. So when you're able to share them, self-disclose them, and hear the emotions of other people, you're also able to see them as an opportunity for growth. This is a way for our relationship to grow. This is a way for us to grow as a couple. This is a way for me and my mom and our relationship to grow. And so one of the things we have to remember, in addition to that, is to choose compassion over contempt. When people are being emotional, when you are being emotional, I think the default is always to be contemptuous or to disregard other people's emotions. What we want to do is make sure that we choose compassion instead. And lastly, focus on what you gained and not lost. This pairs really well with number 2. Make sure that you not only see challenging situations as opportunities for growth, but also, instead of figuring out, the other day I was feeling really bad, and then this bad thing happened, and then this bad thing happened, and then this bad thing happened, we tend to rethink events in that way, which only leads us to be more debilitative. If you are doing well, and you are doing well in school, or you are managing a conflict well with your romantic partner, or you are parenting really well, whatever it is that you've done really well at and gained very well, focus on that first and use that as kind of your vehicle to continue to be in a facilitative emotional state. Don't allow yourself to focus on the things that you've lost, because that'll just kind of kick you into a debilitative emotional state. What we want is facilitative, okay? With that being said, that is chapter 8, y'all. So we learned quite a lot about our feelings today. We were in our feelings. And so now we can all just go listen to Drake, right? And think about how we need to be more facilitative and not debilitative.